Liz Collin here. Thank you for joining us and welcome to Liz Collin Reports, a place for truth and meaningful Minnesota conversations. On the podcast today, we are taking you to the state capitol, at least with this conversation, as the 2022 session winds down, or at least should be winding down according to the calendar. May 23rd is the adjournment date. House Minority Leader Kurt Daudt is my guest today. But before we bring him in, I want you to listen to what he had to say as Democrats recently brought their public safety bill to the floor.
Minneapolis Crime Watch on Twitter within the last couple of hours. A white truck pulling a dumpster down Minnehaha Avenue near 35th Street that is actively on fire. That happened while we were debating this bill. Minneapolis has had its 31st homicide while we have debated this bill. And you are about to pass a public safety bill which is not going to keep anyone safe. I didn't hear a Democrat defending a victim or the family member of a victim. Your cities are burning, and you are watching. All I can think about is this bill is just like that burning dumpster getting towed down the street in Minneapolis tonight. Not a penny for law enforcement, reducing sentences for criminals, and allowances to let violent criminals out of jail to reoffend. Those are the priorities of Democrats in the state of Minnesota.
Representative Daudt, thanks for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me.
I know you're on the phone, you're on the go today, but I do want to start with that public safety bill. You made it quite clear your feelings about the plan on the other side of the aisle. And this was during a stretch of 3 homicides in 24 hours in Minneapolis, as you're kind of talking about this crime spree in real time, very passionately, I might add. And lawmakers debated this for 7 hours on that day on April 29th. But just quantify for our listeners how big of an issue public safety is right now in St. Paul this session.
Well, we think it's the biggest issue that voters are going to care about in the election. Everybody's talking about it. You know, obviously on the news every day, people are hearing the increased crime rates, and you know, we think it's also the thing that tugs at the heartstrings, right? Safety is a fear thing that people aren't going to, you know, they're going to change their habits and their travel if they don't feel safe in a place. And so it's a deeply emotional thing that you know, people want that need to feel safe. And I think Democrats' plan has been a failure in that to that end. And I think you're seeing that in the results of the rising crime rates across the Twin Cities.
Where do things stand at this point at the Capitol when it comes to the public safety bill? Will we be any safer after this year's legislative session?
Well, I think that, you know, I would hope that we could. Some of the problems that we have really are Democrats are wanting to invest in things that are not law enforcement related. They want alternatives to law enforcement, which are unproven, untested, frankly, and without they lack oversight and structure. And you know, we've seen some big problems with those sorts of approaches in other places. You've got, you know, places like the city of Chicago that have pulled out of some of those alternate plans. And what we really need, you know, the biggest problem in the city of Minneapolis is that we're down, you know, 300 plus police officers. And the reality is that could take, you know, a decade to refill those positions and get back to where they should be. So what we think and what we want to do is make sure that we're investing in programs that will incentivize folks to go into the law enforcement field, to attract more people, more candidates, and more folks that can ultimately become police officers in these cities.
On that note, during your testimony, you peeled back the onion a bit in the Democrats' plan, what they're proposing to provide funding for. And I want our listeners to hear that.
Ensuring that victims and family members of homicides and non-fatal shootings have access to resources. Convenient mental health treatment and grief counseling. Worthy. Assistance for funerals and burial expenses. Emergency assistance for relocation expenses. Emergency shelter. Emergency transportation. lost wage assistance. Do you know what those victims' family members would rather have? Their family member, the one who was killed. That's what they would rather have. And I think they'd like some of the money in this bill to actually prevent that crime.
So you made the point there at the end, but hey, let's spend money to actually prevent this. What seems to be the disconnect in your mind?
Well, I think, Democrats are in a tough spot because they're a lot of their base who has a lot of power right now in their party. And as we're going through the endorsement process and the primary process, those people have an outsized voice, and they can't be seen as investing in law enforcement. So it's just that's a disconnect with where most Minnesotans are at. So, we very strongly believe that the real problem here is that we've just got a lack of law enforcement. I think the city of Minneapolis has said they're not responding or they're not doing anything proactive. They're only responding to calls that they get. So there's just a lack of presence out there on the streets. And of course, that is a magnet for illegal activity and for crime. And we're seeing the results of that.
And going to the GOP side, where does the wish list stand at this point? There's been a flurry of proposals, but let's say top 2 or 3 in your mind. What would make an immediate difference here?
Well, I think what we would want to see is probably increased funding, both for law enforcement and for attracting folks into or incentivizing folks into the law enforcement field. On top of that, I think we would want to raise some of the penalties for criminal activity that's becoming the problem right now. One example of that might be the carjacking problem, kind of raising the penalties for that to dissuade people from participating in that sort of behavior. And unfortunately, we've got a situation where judges and, judges are downward departing, I think, on, more than 50% of the cases that are, felony level, crimes. And so the message to criminals is, there's not going to be people to catch you, or there's going to be less people. And 2, if you do get caught, we're going to let you out right away, catch and release, or we're going to, downward depart so you don't get as severe a penalty as you should, frankly. So I think we would want a law and order message, which is more money for law enforcement and stronger penalties if you do break the law.
I want to bring up another issue kind of breaking right now in the news, this kind of deep dive that Alpha News did into this proposed Justin Tigan law. It sounds like something you've been briefed about, but this is a well-known activist, Toshira Garraway, who has been telling this story at the Capitol and in many other forums as well about her fiance being brutally murdered, as she says, by the St. Paul Police Department 12 years ago. So we took a look at that entire case, talked to people who were connected at the time. That basically shows what she's saying is not true. And there is this proposed law that has made its way to St. Paul based on a lie. But I'm curious, your reaction to that. And again, this law is sort of tied up with the public safety bill at this point.
Well, I think, our concern, and I had been kind of briefed on this over time as it was kind of unfolding. So I've known about it for some time. I think the first I became aware of it was probably late last summer or last fall. So I've been watching it a little bit. But the reality is, I think, Democrats, and, you had somebody come into to state to hearings in the state legislature and basically lie. And Democrats, the real problem is Democrats wanted to believe that was true instead of check it and say, that sounds a little, fantasized and blown out of proportion. Is this really true? They wanted to believe that it was true. And so for me, my biggest concern is that, when we perpetuate this sort of misinformation or lies, what we're doing is we're actually creating a situation where there's distrust between law enforcement and members of the community. And ultimately what that does is it puts both parties at risk. So if there's an altercation or an interaction between law enforcement and a member of the community, if the community automatically distrusts law enforcement and they do that because Democrat legislators are perpetuating that sort of a message, that basically puts in that interaction, it creates a situation where you've got an adversarial relationship and a potential for that and that's what we've seen. And obviously some of these bigger cases in recent years, that's what we've seen is where these get out of control and ultimately there's been, in worst case scenarios, there's a loss of life. So and I think Democrats need to own the fact that they are perpetuating that sort of distrust, which actually endangers not only the law enforcement officers' lives, but the community's lives as well.
Good points. Thank you for covering that. I did also reach out to Crime Watch. Crime Watch is someone you quoted, I noticed, on the
Yes.
House floor. But, the very popular citizen Twitter reporter. But they were wondering about these nonprofit community groups and something you've brought up before. Sort of the lack of accountability or detailed measures of success for these nonprofit groups. So Crime Watch is saying, from what they've seen, they get more money. The theory is that taxpayers keep shoveling them money. They fund new cars, their friends, relatives, no incentives to really help fix the problems. They keep getting funded as crime goes up. Do you think anything will change this session on that when it comes to that accountability piece? Crime Watch is wondering, and I thought that was a good question to throw your way.
Yeah, I think that is a problem, and we've talked about that. I mean, you think of how much oversight and accountability there is on law enforcement officers, and now they want these community groups to step in and do the job of law enforcement officers. They want to give them state taxpayer dollars without any real accountability or without any real transparency on where that money's going or what it's being used for. And then we're not providing them the training, and we don't have the sort of oversight to hold them accountable if there is a problem. And there are very big, I spoke about it in that speech on the House floor, there's some very big examples of where there have been, lawsuits and that sort of thing. And there isn't a group that automatically can hold them accountable. Not even like a city council can, as they can a police department. For instance, you can't go in and fire one employee. You can cut their contract, but you can't go in and fire one employee or hold them accountable in a way that you would normally be able to. And we just don't see the level of transparency that you would with a government entity that's providing that law enforcement support.
I also wanted to talk about fentanyl. You talked about trying to increase the penalties for fentanyl that's killing Minnesotans. We did some recent reporting up in Duluth about this issue, their commitment to trying to hold dealers accountable. But do you see that criminal threshold changing this session?
Well, here's a great example of Democrats wanting to lower sentences and lower penalties for criminals and always wanting to believe criminals and being sympathetic to criminals instead of actually listening to and being sympathetic to and preventing people from becoming victims. So fentanyl is a great example. The penalties for that are lower than other drugs of the past, right? That we've commonly been aware of, like heroin and cocaine. Yet fentanyl is 50 times more lethal than, and sometimes in cases many more times than that, but at least 50 times more lethal than heroin, and more potent and more powerful. So it's a drug that, I think we just reached a threshold in the country where we're surpassed, the highest level of deaths in a year based on drug overdoses. And that's because of fentanyl. We've got members of our caucus who have lost, and members of the legislature have lost kids to this. And I think it's impacting every one of our lives, but we're not going to stop it by letting people go and by, reducing sentences and not holding people accountable. And unfortunately, the Democrats find themselves caught in this position where they can't really hold any criminals accountable because it's not in vogue with their kind of progressive base.
And lastly, as I know you have to get going here, but I was just going to ask you about the budget surplus, the $9 billion budget surplus. A lot of Minnesotans watching that as inflation, of course, is climbing, holding out for tax relief. But where does that stand at this point? How do you think that will all go down here in the final days?
Well, I think, as we've got just a little less than 2 weeks left of the session, we actually are a little less than the $9 billion now because we had we had a surplus in the general fund. We had a deficit in that unemployment trust fund. So we took care of that unemployment trust fund. And there's been some little odds and ends spending in addition to that, but we're down to a little over $7 billion right now. But just got news this week that we picked up another $1 billion in surplus revenue just last month. So that's going to probably continue to grow until we do some permanent tax relief. The outlook on whether that'll happen this session or not, I think really I would expect that Democrats are going to want to trade, if they do any permanent tax relief, they're going to want to trade permanent spending for it. And The reality is, we already have a fully funded state budget that we passed last year. I don't see the need to go in and broadly increase state spending. I mean, go ahead and look at the House Democrats' targets. They want to increase spending $21 for every dollar of permanent tax relief. And when we've got a $9 billion surplus that tells us we're collecting more money than we need from taxpayers to fund state government, the answer is really we have to reduce those taxes. And the reality is, in our competitiveness with our neighboring states and other places across the country, we have to become more competitive, or we're going to continue to drive businesses and retirees, for example, to other states. So, and that's only going to make the problem worse. So I think we have to do the tax relief, but I fear that, trading permanent spending for it is going to be something that we shouldn't, we really should not do that. And, I think this next election is going to, correct some things in who's in the majority, from my perspective in the House. So I would almost rather sit on that surplus until next year when we can do the real permanent tax relief that Minnesotans need without having to trade it for permanent increases in spending that we don't really need right now.
And you're talking about some important elections coming up. But yeah, what is your final thoughts to Minnesotans as we look ahead to a busy fall and also the convention coming up this weekend in Rochester?
Well, obviously a lot of stuff going on, but this is a big election year, and it appears that there's a wave building offshore, and obviously that looks like it's moving in the direction of Republicans pretty strongly. Folks are not happy with what's going on in Washington, D.C. They're not happy with the record inflation. They're not happy with the crime and the rising crime rates, and they don't feel safe in their communities. So add that all together, and it spells a potential disastrous election for Democrats. So while we will likely benefit from that, we also need to be ready to lead this state in a way that is going to make us more competitive and make sure that Minnesotans feel more safe and that parents have a voice in their kids' education. And I could go on and on and on, right? But, we're ready to do that. And I think the folks are looking for other people to run our state, because what's been going on right now with Democrats in charge has not been good for the state of Minnesota.
Republican House Minority Leader Kurt Daudt. Kurt, thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
And that will do it for this episode of Collin Reports. We'll be back soon to keep meaningful Minnesota conversations going. Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, follow on Spotify, or any other podcast platform. To stay up to date on all things Alpha News, sign up for our free daily newsletter on our website and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks again for tuning in. We'll see you next time.